The second miracle. Matilda did not join the rush to get out of the classroom. After the other children had all disappeared, she remained at her desk, quiet and thoughtful. She knew she had to tell somebody about what had happened with the glass. She can't possibly keep a giant secret like the bottle up inside her. What she needs was just one person, one wise and sympathetic grown-up who could help her to understand the meaning of this extraordinary happening. Neither her mother nor her father would be of any use at all. If they believed her story, and it was doubtful they would, they almost certainly would fail to realize what an astounding event it was that had taken place in the classroom that afternoon. On the spur of the moment, Matilda decided that the one person she would like to confide in was Miss Honey. Matilda and Miss Honey were now the only two left in the classroom. Miss Honey had seated herself at her table and was refilling through some papers. She looked up and said, "Well, Matilda, aren't you going outside with the others?" Matilda said, "Please, may I talk to you for a moment?" "Of course you may." "What's troubling you?" "Something very particular has happened to me, Mrs. Honey." Mrs. Honey became instantly alert. Never seen the two distraught meaning she had had recently about Matilda. The first with the headmistress, and the second with the dreadful Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood. Mrs. Honey had been thinking a great deal about this child, and wondering how she could help her. And now here was Matilda, sitting in the classroom with a curiously exalted look on her face, and asked if she would have a private talk. Mrs. Honey had never seen her looking so wide-eyed and particularly before. "Yes, Matilda," she said. "Tell me what has happened to you that is so particular. Mrs. Trunchbull isn't going to expel me, is she?" Tilda asked. "Because it wasn't me who put that creature in her jug of water. I promise you it wasn't." "I knew it wasn't," Mrs. Honey said. "Am I going to be expelled?" "I think not," Mrs. Honey said. "The headmistress simply got a little overexcited, that's all." "Good," Matilda said. "But that isn't what I want to talk to you about." "What do you want to talk to me about, Matilda?" "I want to talk to you about the glass of water with the creature in it," Matilda said. "You saw it spilling all over Mrs. Trunchbull, didn't you?" "I did indeed." "Well, Mrs. Honey, I didn't touch it. I never went near it." "I know you didn't," Mrs. Honey said. "You had me telling the Miss Headmistress that it couldn't possibly have been you." "Ah, but it was me, Mrs. Honey," Matilda said. "That's exactly what I want to talk to you about." Mrs. Honey pushed and looked carefully at the children. "I don't think I quite follow you," she said. "I got so angry at being accused of something I hadn't done that. I mean, it happened. You mean what happened, Matilda? I mean the glass tipped over. I still didn't quite understand what you mean, Mrs. Honey said gently. I did it with my eyes, Hilda said. I was staring at it and wishing it tip, and then my eyes went all hot, and the glass just toppled over. Mrs. Honey continued to look steadily at Matilda through her steel-rimmed skilled, and Matilda looked back at her just as startled. I am still not following you, Mrs. Honey said. Do you mean you actually willed the glass to tip over? Yes, Matilda said, with my eyes. Mrs. Honey was silent for a moment. She did not think Matilda was meaning to tell a lie. It was more likely that she was simply allowing her vivid imagination to run away with her. You mean you were sitting where you are now and you told the class to topple over and it did? Something like that, Mrs. Honey said. If you did that, then it is just about the greatest miracle a person has ever performed since the time of Jesus. I did it, Mrs. Honey. It is extraordinary thought, Mrs. Honey. How often small children have fights over fancy like this. She decided to put an end to it as gently as possible. Could you do it again? She asked. Not unlikely. I don't know, Matilda said, but I think I might be able to. Mrs. Honey moved the new empty glass to the middle of the table. Should I put water in it? She asked, smiling a little. I don't think it matters, Tilda said. Very well, then. Go ahead and tip it over. It may take some time. Take all the time you want. Mrs. Honey said, I am in no hurry. Matilda, sitting in the second row about 10 feet away from Mrs. Honey, put her elbows on the desk and cupped her face in her hands. And this time she gave the order right at the beginning. Tip the glass, tip. She ordered, but her lips didn't move and she made no sound. She simply shouted the words inside her head, and now the contained the whole of her mind and her brain and her will up into her eyes. And once again, but much more quickly than before, she felt the electric gathering and the power was beginning to surge and the hotness was coming into the eyeballs. And then the millions of tiny individual arms were hands on them, were shooting out towards the glass, and without making any sound at all, she kept on shouting. Without making any sound at all, she kept on shouting inside her head for the glass to go over. She saw it wobble, then it tilt, then it toppled right over and fell with a tinkle on the tabletop, not twinkling inch from Mrs. Honey's folded arm. Mrs. Honey's mouth dropped open and her eyes stretched to so wide you could see the whites all around. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The shock of seeing the miracle performed had struck her dumb. She gaped at the glass, leaning well away from it now, as though it might be a dangerous thing. Then slowly she lifted her head and looked at Matilda. She saw the child white in the face, as white as paper, trembling all over, the eyes glazed, staring straight ahead and seeing nothing. The whole face was transfigured, the eyes round and bright, and she was sitting there speechless, quite beautiful in the breeze of silence. Mrs. Honey waited, tumbling a little herself, and watched the children as she slowly stirred herself back into consciousness. And then suddenly click went her face into a look of almost scrapers calm. "I'm all right," she said and smiled. "I'm quite all right, Mrs. Honey, so don't be alarmed. You seem so far away," Mrs. Honey whispered, awe-struck. "Oh, I was flying past the stars on silver wings," Matilda said. "It was wonderful." Mrs. Honey was still gazing at the child in absolute wonderment, as though she were the curtain, the beginning of the world. The first morning, it went much quicker this time, Matilda said quietly. "It's not possible." Mrs. Honey was gasping. "I didn't believe it. I simply couldn't believe it." She closed her eyes and kept them closed for quite a while, and when she opened them again, it seemed as though she had gathered herself together. "Would you like to come back and have tea at my cottage?" she asked. "Oh, I'd love to," Matilda said. "Good. Gather up your things and I'll meet you outside in a couple of minutes. You won't tell anyone about this thing that I did, will you, Mrs. Honey?" "I won't dream of it," Mrs. Honey said.